The knock at the door came at the worst possible moment. Evelyn Finley had her hands buried in a basin of cold water, scrubbing blood from a pair of small stockings, her knuckles raw and her eyes burning from 3 nights without proper sleep. Little me had fallen from the fence post again, and 6-year-old Clara had screamed so loud the neighbors' horses had gone wild. Evelyn had wrapped the cut, sung the songs, wiped the tears, and now stood in the lamplight at 9:30 in the evening doing laundry because tomorrow was Sunday and the girls needed clean clothes for church, and if she didn't do it now she would not have time to do it at all. The knock came again, harder this time. Not polite, insistent. Evelyn dried her hands on her apron and crossed to the door, lifting the iron latch. She expected the town sheriff, Garrett Holt, who had made a habit of stopping by to remind her, in that slick and condescending way of his, that a woman alone with 2 children had no business trying to keep a working homestead. She expected bad news. She was always expecting bad news these days, because bad news was all that had come to her door since the letter arrived 9 months ago telling her that her sister Ruth and Ruth's husband, Tom Calloway, had both died of fever on the road west from Missouri, leaving behind 2 daughters, me, age 4, and Clara, age 6, with no one in the world but Evelyn. She was not expecting the man who stood on her porch. He was enormous. That was the first thing. Not in the soft, broad way of the feed store men, or the cattle ranchers with their comfortable bellies. This man was built the way the mountains behind Colton Ridge were built, hard and uncompromising, layered with something ancient and weathered that had been tested by every season. He stood at least 6'3", with dark hair that reached the collar of a worn canvas coat, and a jaw hidden partly behind a short, dark beard that was just beginning to show threads of gray at the edges. His eyes, when the lamplight caught them, were an unsettling shade of pale gray, like winter sky before snow falls. He held his hat in his hands, which was the only polite thing about him, because everything else about him suggested a man who had not been inside a room with walls in a considerable amount of time. "You are Evelyn Finley," he said. It was not a question. She tightened her hand on the door frame. "Who is asking?" "Charles Yates." He said his name the way men said things they were certain of, flat, final. "I worked the timber line above Colton Pass for the last 4 years. Before that I had a spread in Montana that burned. I heard in town you are looking for a hired hand and that you have been looking for one since March." Evelyn stared at him. The wind off the ridge was cold against her face and she could hear me turning in her small cot in the back room, that half-dreaming murmur that meant the child was not fully settled. She had posted that notice in March. It was now September of 1874. 6 months of watching men read that notice, look at the house, look at her, and decide the situation was too complicated. "It is late," she said carefully. "I know it is," he said. "I came down from the pass today, and the notice is still on the board at Hatcher's store, which means you still need help. I have nowhere pressing to be tonight, and I did not want to wait until morning and find someone else had taken the position." "No one has taken the position in 6 months," she said, and then immediately wished she hadn't because it revealed more than she intended. Something moved in those pale gray eyes. Not pity. She would have shut the door for pity. It was more like recognition. "Then we should talk," he said. She let him in. It had not always been like this. There had been a time, not so very long ago, when Evelyn Finley had been a schoolteacher in the town of Harlan, Kansas, with a small salary, a small room above the schoolhouse, and the uncomplicated satisfaction of a life that made sense. She had been 26 then, and she had believed that the kind of life she wanted, the quiet, ordered kind, was achievable through persistence and careful choices. She had never been beautiful in the way that drew immediate attention. She was striking in a slower way. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned severely during the week and only let fall loose on Sunday mornings, green eyes that were more intelligent than warm at first glance, and a posture that made her seem taller than her 5 feet 4 inches. She had been careful and controlled and sensible, and she had believed those qualities would protect her. Then Ruth's letter had arrived in October of 1873. Ruth had been 5 years younger than Evelyn, wild and impulsive and deeply in love with Tom Calloway from the age of 17. Ruth had followed Tom west, and Evelyn had written faithfully every month and prayed faithfully every Sunday for her sister's safety. And then came the letter from a stranger, a traveling minister named Brother Josiah Pratt, who had been with Ruth and Tom when the fever took them both within 4 days of each other outside of a settlement in the Nebraska Territory. 2 little girls. No father, no mother, no other family, just Evelyn. She had given up her teaching post, packed everything she owned into 2 trunks, and come to Colton Ridge, Colorado, where Tom had bought land before the fever. The homestead was 160 acres of mostly good grazing land with a creek running through the lower quarter, and a house that had been built solidly enough, but was showing the specific neglect of a property where the owner had never arrived to care for it. Evelyn had arrived in January with 6-year-old Clara and 4-year-old me, and about $47 to her name, and the knowledge that she understood children well enough, but understood livestock and farming not at all. 9 months of learning by terrible mistake had brought her to this September evening with $31 left, a leaking roof over the back bedroom, a garden that had produced adequately but not generously, 4 chickens, 2 pigs, and a mule named General that she was deeply attached to and deeply frustrated by in equal measure. She had sold 2 of the pigs in July and used the money to buy feed. She had mended everything that could be mended. She had asked for no help from the town because every time she walked into town people looked at her the way people look at something they expect to fail, and she had decided she would rather struggle in private than fail publicly. And then there was Sheriff Garrett Holt, who had started coming around in May with a different kind of interest. Holt was 41, twice widowed, and had developed the unsettling conviction that Evelyn's situation made her a practical candidate for a 3rd wife. He had not said this directly. Men like Holt never said difficult things directly. He had said things like, "A woman in your position ought to have a man to rely on, and those little girls need a father's steadying hand. And most recently, last Tuesday, I could make things considerably easier for you, Miss Finley, if you were of a mind to be reasonable." She had told him she was perfectly reasonable and shown him out. But his visits were becoming more frequent, and his language more specific, and she had begun to feel the particular cold dread of a woman who understood that a man with a certain kind of power had decided she was his business. She told none of this to Charles Yates when she sat him at the kitchen table and set coffee in front of him. She told him about the homestead. The acreage, the condition of the fence lines, the state of the barn, the fact that the roof needed patching before winter arrived in earnest, that she had been attempting to break the lower field for spring planting but had made slow progress, and that the mule was reliable but stubborn. She told him what she could offer in wages, which was not much, and that room and board would be part of the arrangement, and that the room was the small one in the barn that Tom had built for exactly this purpose. Charles Yates listened to all of this without interrupting. He held the coffee cup in both hands and his eyes moved around the kitchen in a methodical way, assessing, cataloging. She could see him calculating, not in a mercenary way, but in the way of a man who looked at a situation and needed to understand its full shape before he responded to it. "The roof," he said when she finished. "How bad is the leak?" "In hard rain enough to wet the floor in the back bedroom where the girls sleep." He nodded slowly. "I can fix that. I can have the fence line on the north quarter repaired before first frost, breaking the lower field depending on how hard the ground is, 3 to 4 weeks. I can make your firewood supply last the winter if I start cutting this week." He paused. "I need to know one thing." "What is that?" "The girls," he said, and his voice dropped a fraction, not into softness exactly, but into something more careful. "How old are they and what do they know about what happened to their parents?" The question caught her off guard. Every other man who had even glanced at this arrangement had treated the presence of the children as an inconvenience to be managed. The question Charles Yates was asking was a different kind of question entirely. "Clara is 6, she said slowly. "Me is 4. Clara knows her mother and father are gone. She has known since the beginning, and she does not speak of it often, but when she does, she is very direct about it. Me is young enough that she knows the word gone but does not fully feel its weight yet. She asks sometimes when her mother is coming." Evelyn stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I tell her that her mother is in heaven and that she loves her very much. I do not know if that is the right answer. I do not know if there is a right answer." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. "There isn't one," Charles Yates said. "A right answer, I mean. You just have to keep showing up and that ends up being enough." She looked at him. "That sounds like something a person learns through experience." Those gray eyes came to hers and held there for a long beat. "It is," he said. And he did not elaborate, and she did not ask, not yet, because there was something in his face that told her the door to that particular room was not fully open, and forcing it would not serve either of them. She hired him that night. She showed him the barn room, which was clean and had a good rope bed and a cast iron stove of its own, and he said it was fine. He brought his belongings in from the spotted horse he'd tied at the gate: a bedroll, 2 canvas bags, a rifle, and a toolbox that was battered and heavy, and suggested a man who had been fixing things for a long time. He did not ask for anything more than what she had offered. He said he would begin at first light. Clara met him the next morning, before Evelyn had finished braiding her hair. The 6-year-old walked out to the yard in her Sunday dress, which was the wrong dress for a Monday, and stood at the fence watching Charles Yates examine the hinge on the barn door with the focused attention of a surgeon. Clara stood very still for almost 2 full minutes, which was unusual for Clara, and then said, very loudly and without preamble, "What is your name?" He looked up. "Charles Yates." "Why are you looking at our door like that?" "Because the hinge is wrong," he said. "It will fall off before winter if nobody fixes it." Clara considered this. "Can you fix it?" "Yes." "Then why are you still just looking at it?" He looked at her for a moment, and then, to Evelyn's profound surprise as she watched from the porch, Charles Yates smiled. It changed his whole face. It cracked through the weathered severity of his features and revealed something underneath that was unexpectedly warm and genuine, like finding a window in a wall you thought was solid. "Fair point," he said to Clara. "I will get my tools." Me, being 4, had a more direct approach. She walked up to Charles Yates that afternoon while he was on the roof nailing shingles, looked up at him from the yard, and announced that she was hungry. He climbed down, took her inside, found the bread on the shelf, and made her a peace with the jar of apple preserves Evelyn kept for special occasions. When Evelyn came in from the garden and found the preserves open, she opened her mouth, closed it, and decided to save that particular conversation for a time when me was not looking at her with those enormous satisfied eyes. "I am sorry about the preserves," Charles said quietly when me had toddled off. "I did not know they were special. I will replace them." "You do not need to replace them," Evelyn said, which was not what she had planned to say. "I will replace them," he said again, and his tone made it clear the matter was settled as far as he was concerned. The first week was a careful negotiation of space and habit. Evelyn was accustomed to having the mornings to herself, that small sacred hour before the girls woke when she could sit with her coffee and her thoughts and be nobody's responsibility for 60 consecutive minutes. Charles respected this without being told. He was up before her and outside before she came down, and he did not come to the kitchen door until the sun was properly up and she had had her hour. She never mentioned this to him. He never mentioned it either. But the fact that he saw it and accommodated it without being asked was the first thing that made her start to feel something more complicated than professional gratitude. He worked with the specific relentless efficiency of a man who had spent years in the mountains where wasted effort meant danger. He fixed the barn door hinge. He patched the roof. He repaired 200 feet of fence along the north quarter and began on the south. He cut firewood for 4 hours every other afternoon, and the stack against the barn grew with alarming speed. He was not gregarious about any of it. He did not require conversation or appreciation, though he accepted thanks quietly when she offered it. He ate whatever she put in front of him at meals with what she came to think of as focused gratitude, as though the act of being fed was something he did not take as a given. At the end of the first week, she found herself curious about him in a way that was inconvenient. The curiosity sharpened in the middle of the second week when Sheriff Garrett Holt rode up on a Friday morning. She had been in the garden with me when she heard the horse on the road, and she had that instinctive tightening across her shoulders before she even turned to look. Holt dismounted at the gate with his particular air of a man who considers every place he enters his territory by right of office. He stopped when he saw Charles Yates coming around the side of the barn with a bucket of feed. The two men looked at each other. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them had texture like the air before lightning. "Miss Finley," Holt said finally, not taking his eyes off Charles, "I see you have acquired some help." "I have," Evelyn said, coming to stand between the garden fence and the gate. She kept her voice pleasant and her posture easy. "Mr. Yates is working the homestead." "Charles Yates," Holt said slowly, and something shifted in his face. Something that looked less like surprise and more like the activation of prior knowledge. "The name is familiar." "Is it?" Charles said. His voice was entirely neutral. He set the bucket down and straightened to his full height, which was a considerable amount of height, and he looked at the sheriff with those pale gray eyes that gave nothing away. "You were up in the timber line," Holt said. "I was. There was some trouble up there 2 winters ago, a claim dispute, a man named Burley." "There was a claim dispute," Charles agreed. "It was resolved in court in Denver. I expect you know that if you know the rest." Holt smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "Just making conversation, Yates." He turned back to Evelyn and swept off his hat with his practiced gallant gesture. "I came to check on you, Miss Finley. Make sure things are in order." "Everything is very much in order," she said. "Thank you for coming, Sheriff." He stayed another 10 minutes, during which he talked about the weather and the upcoming harvest festival and the fact that Mrs. Harlow's boy had gone and broken his leg, and Evelyn answered everything politely and kept herself positioned between him and the house. When he finally rode away, she stood watching until the dust settled. "He has been coming by regularly," Charles said behind her. It was not a question. She turned. He was looking not at her but at the road where Holt's horse had gone. His jaw was set. "Since May," she said, and she was not sure why she told him the truth so easily. Probably because there was something in Charles Yates' manner that made deception seem like a wasted effort. He nodded. "He will not like having me here. He does not own this property." "No," Charles said. He picked up the bucket again. "But men like that take some time to understand that." It was a week later that me had her nightmare. Evelyn heard her first, as she always did, a thin, high sound coming through the dark that was more desolate than screaming. She went quickly, but me was already sitting up and the crying had escalated to the hiccuping, desperate kind by the time Evelyn reached her cot and gathered the small body against her chest. She held me and rocked her and murmured the sounds that were not quite words, and Clara across the room sat up with her dark eyes wide and afraid. "Is she sick?" Clara asked. "Just a dream, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." Clara lay down obediently, but she did not go back to sleep. She lay watching Evelyn with those 2 old eyes of hers, and Evelyn held me and thought about how unfair it was, the particular unfairness of children who had done nothing wrong and suffered the consequences of the world's carelessness anyway. The crying eventually quieted and me's small body went limp with exhaustion. Evelyn settled her back down, pulled the quilt up, and straightened. When she went to the kitchen to get herself a glass of water before going back to bed, she stopped. Charles Yates was sitting at the kitchen table. He was in his work clothes, clearly not having been to bed yet, and he had a lamp burning low beside him and what looked like a worn letter in his hands, though he folded it quickly when she came in. He looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "I heard her," he said finally. "I wanted to be sure everything was all right." She has nightmares sometimes, Evelyn said. She went to the water pail and dipped a cup. Her hands were steadier than her heartbeat. The smaller ones do when they have lost people. The dreams come. He was quiet. Then unexpectedly he said, "My son had nightmares." She turned to look at him. The lamp made shadows of his face. He was looking at the table, at the folded letter under his hands. He was 5, he said. After his mother passed, he had nightmares for almost a year. The kitchen was very still. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals and the only light was the lamp. Outside, the Colorado night was enormous and cold. "Where is he now?" Evelyn asked carefully. "Your son." Charles Yates looked up at her. The gray eyes were unguarded in a way she had not seen before, a way that told her this was not something he spoke of easily. "He died," he said. "The same winter my spread burned. He was 7. It was a hard winter and he was already weakened from being sick. The fever took him in January of 1871. The words landed between them like stones dropped into deep water. Evelyn stood very still. "I am sorry," she said, and she meant it in the full and terrible weight of the phrase, not as a courtesy but as the only true response to that particular kind of loss. "Thank you," he said. He said it simply, without the reflexive deflection she had seen in men who considered emotion a weakness. He just accepted it. She sat down at the table across from him. She was not sure why, except that the night was late and the house was quiet, and she was tired in the way that sometimes dissolves the careful barriers people maintain between themselves in daylight. "His name?" she asked. "Eli," he said. And she could see what the name cost him, the slight contraction around his eyes, the deliberate steadiness of his breath. He had his mother's eyes, brown, very dark. He could make any animal trust him inside of 5 minutes, even General, the ghost of a smile. He would have liked that mule. General is deeply likable once you accept that he will never do anything you ask him to on the first request, Evelyn said. Charles laughed. It was a quiet laugh, low and real, and it altered the temperature of the room in a way she was not prepared for. She felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the dying fire. "What was his mother's name?" she asked. "Alice," he said. "She died in the spring of 1869. We had been married 4 years. The birth of our second child, it did not go well. The child came too early and we lost them both." Evelyn absorbed this. "You have carried a great deal of grief." "Everyone carries grief," he said. "The question is just whether you let it bury you or whether you keep digging." She looked at him across the lamplight. He was watching her with that careful attention that she was beginning to recognize as his default way of seeing things. Nothing rushed, nothing assumed, just looking until he understood. "You are digging," she said. "I am trying to," he said. "I suspect you are as well." It was the most honest conversation she had had with another adult in 9 months. She went to bed an hour later and lay awake for a long time staring at the ceiling, aware of a dangerous shift in the gravity of things. October arrived with cold nights and brilliant days, and the particular smell of the mountains in autumn that was pine and ice, and something wild underneath everything. The Harvest Festival in town was the 3rd Saturday of the month, and Evelyn prepared for it with the children with the specific organized pleasure of a woman who had learned to be grateful for small structured joys. Charles drove them into town on the wagon, which caused a considerable stir. Colton Ridge was not a large town, perhaps 400 souls, and the arrival of a woman alone with 2 nieces had already been the subject of extensive discussion. The arrival of that same woman with a large mountain man who handled the team with quiet competence and lifted both girls down from the wagon with 1 arm each as though they weighed nothing at all, was an even more interesting development. Clara walked next to Charles at the festival with the proprietary air of a child who has decided someone belongs to her. She introduced him to her friend Bethy Marsh as Mr. Yates, who fixed our roof and also knows about horses. Me held his hand for the first 20 minutes until she discovered the candy stand and transferred her loyalties immediately. Evelyn watched all of this from the edges of the festival and felt something she did not have a name for yet. It was warm and it was frightening and it was, she was fairly certain, beginning to be important. Holt found her near the pie table. "You look well, Miss Finley," he said. He was in his best jacket, the dark one with the silver buttons, and he had the careful, groomed look of a man who had made a deliberate effort. "I have been meaning to speak to you about something of a personal nature." She kept her expression neutral. "Is that so?" "I think you know what I want to say," he said, dropping his voice to that intimate register that she found deeply presumptuous. "I have been patient. I understand you needed time to settle in and find your footing, but winter is coming and a woman in your position, a woman with responsibilities, ought to give serious thought to a stable arrangement." "I have a stable arrangement," she said. "The homestead is functioning well." His jaw tightened. "I am talking about marriage, Miss Finley. I am offering you a serious proposition. My house in town is warm and large. You and those girls would want for nothing." She looked at him steadily. "I want for nothing now, Sheriff." "You have a drifter living in your barn," he said, and the pleasantness dropped out of his voice. "A man with a troubled history. You do not know what you have brought onto your property." "I know exactly what I have brought onto my property," she said. "A capable, honest man who does what he says he will do, which has been my consistent experience of him." Holt's eyes moved across the festival to where Charles stood with me on his shoulders so she could see the puppet show. Something cold moved through Holt's expression. "You are making a mistake," he said quietly. "I will not offer again." "I understand," she said. And then, because she had been raised with manners and she believed in them even when they were difficult, she said, "I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival, Sheriff Holt," and walked away. Her heart was hammering, but her face was entirely composed. She went and stood next to Charles, who set me on the ground without being asked because he had seen her coming. He did not ask what the conversation with Holt had been about. He simply shifted slightly so he was standing at her shoulder, not in front of her, never that, but beside her, in the way of a man who understands the difference between protection and interference. She said quietly without looking at him, "He just told me he would not offer again." "Good," Charles said, equally quiet. "He implied you have a troubled history." A pause. "I do not have a troubled history," Charles said. "I have a claim dispute that was resolved legally and a man named Burley who did not like losing and who has friends in low offices in several counties." His voice was level. "I will tell you the whole of it if you want to hear it." She looked at him sideways. "Yes," she said. "I do want to hear it." That evening, after the girls were in bed, he told her. They sat on the porch in the cold Colorado night with cups of coffee growing cold between their hands, and he told her about the timber claim in Montana, the dispute with Burley over water rights, the confrontation that had resulted in Evelyn finding out that Charles Yates had once, in defense of himself and his property, shot a man. Shot, not killed. The man had recovered. The court in Denver had reviewed the matter and found it lawful self-defense and dismissed all charges. But men like Burley kept their grudges like currency and spent them at every opportunity. "He has reached Holt, then," Evelyn said. "It appears so," Charles said. "I should have told you before you hired me." "You had a right to know. You are telling me now." "I am." She wrapped both hands around her cup. The stars over the ridge were fierce and close. "Is there anything else?" she asked. "Any other secrets I should know about?" He was quiet for a moment. "I drink whiskey when the winter gets bad," he said. "Not to excess, not recklessly, but I drink it. I want you to know that." She looked at him. "That is the confession you have chosen to offer." It seemed honest. "It is honest," she said. And she smiled, a small one but real. "My father drank too much, which is why I notice such things. I will tell you now plainly, if it ever became a problem here, I would address it directly." "I would expect nothing less," he said. "Then we understand each other." "Yes," he said. And those gray eyes found hers in the dark and stayed there for a moment longer than was entirely necessary, and she felt the warmth move through her again, less frightening this time, more like something she was beginning to make room for. November came cold and fast. Charles had the firewood supply built to a height that satisfied even his apparently rigorous standards for preparation. And when the first real snow fell on the 8th of the month, the house was sealed and warm and ready. The girls stood at the window in their nightgowns, watching the snow come down with the absolute wonder of children for whom weather is not yet a practical problem but a pure experience. And Charles came in from the barn stamping snow from his boots and stood behind them looking out over their heads at the white darkness. And Clara reached up and took his hand without looking at him, and he let her hold it. And Evelyn had to look away because something in the scene pressed against the inside of her chest in a way that ached. She was falling in love with him. She knew it with the same clarity with which she knew the multiplication tables and the conjugation of Latin verbs, that clean, cool certainty of a thing that has been established beyond reasonable doubt. She also knew, with equal clarity, that the situation was complicated in ways that made her feel something close to despair. He was employed by her. He was a man who had suffered catastrophic losses and had been alone with his grief for 3 years in the mountains. He had given her no direct indication, no clear signal, that his feelings had moved past the professional and the friendly. And she was a woman who had her nieces to think of, and the homestead to protect, and a reputation in a small town that was already the subject of more than enough speculation. A wrong step could cost her everything. She resolved to be careful and sensible, and to manage whatever she felt with the discipline she had applied to everything else that was difficult. She lasted approximately 4 days. It was a Tuesday evening, mid-November, and she had spent the afternoon at the table trying to make the accounts come out more favorably than they actually did. The numbers were better than September, considerably better. Charles's work had reduced the costs of several things she had been paying the Marsh boy to do poorly, and the firewood situation meant she would not have to buy from the merchant in town at the elevated winter price. But the spring planting would require seed money, and she was still watching every cent. She rubbed her eyes and pushed the ledger away and became aware that Charles had come in from the barn and was standing at the kitchen counter making something. She watched him, not intending to stare, but he had his back to her and she was tired and her defenses were down. He moved with that characteristic unhurried efficiency, and she was struck again, as she had been many times, by the contradiction between his size and his gentleness. He had enormous hands. Those hands had repaired every broken thing on the property and had also, once, when Mee had a splinter she would not let Evelyn touch, coaxed the little girl into trust with a patience so absolute it had taken 15 minutes and involved the telling of an elaborate story about a bear named William, and had removed the splinter so carefully Mee had not felt it at all. "You are staring," he said, without turning around. She felt heat flood her face. "I was resting my eyes." "In my direction," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. She opened her mouth to say something sharp and deflecting, and instead she said, "Charles." He turned then. He was holding a pot of what appeared to be stew he had started while she was working, which she had not asked him to do and which she was, in this moment, deeply grateful for. He looked at her with those steady gray eyes. She was going to say something sensible. She was certain of it. Instead she said, "I am trying very hard not to be foolish." The pot went onto the stove. He moved to the table and sat down across from her, not quite where he usually sat, closer. He folded his hands on the table and looked at her with an attention that she now understood was not going to look away from whatever she said next. "What would foolish be?" he asked. "Feeling things I have no business feeling," she said, "for someone in the situation I am in." "What situation is that?" "A woman responsible for 2 children and a homestead and a fragile financial position," she said. "A woman who cannot afford to make choices based on feeling rather than practicality." His hands on the table were very still. "And what are you feeling?" he said very quietly. "That concerns you." She looked at him. She had always found cowardice deeply contemptible. She said, "I'm feeling a great deal more than is appropriate for an employer to feel about a hired hand. I am telling you this because you are honest with me and I believe in being honest in return, and because if I continue to feel it in silence, I will eventually do something worse than say it plainly." The room was very still. Charles Yates looked at her for a long time. The fire in the stove and the lamp on the table and the sound of the wind under the eaves were the only things in the world. "Evelyn," he said. He used her name. It was the first time he had used it without prompting, and the sound of it in his voice, that low, careful voice, did something to the region of her sternum. "I have been trying to be appropriate," he said. "I have been trying to be what is useful to you and not to make your situation more complicated than it already is. I have been trying," he said, and there was something in his voice now that was not quite steady, "not to look at you the way I look at you." Her breath had gone shallow. "Because you are my employer," he said, "and because I do not want you to feel you are in a position you did not choose. And because I have spent 3 years convincing myself I was finished with the kind of feelings that are currently proving very difficult to argue with." He stopped. "I am not telling you to act on anything," he said carefully. "I am only telling you that you are not alone in this. That is all." She had meant to be careful. She had meant to be sensible. She said, "That is a great deal." "It is," he agreed. They ate the stew. They talked about the fence on the south quarter and whether the lower field could be started before the deep freeze set in and whether Mee was ready to learn her letters. And under all of it was a new awareness, a charged and tender thing that had no name yet but had been given a shape by the courage of being honest. It was Clara who pushed them forward, as Clara had a habit of doing. It was the first Saturday in December, and Clara had been invited to Bethy Marsh's house for the afternoon, which left Evelyn with me, who fell asleep after lunch with the complete and sudden decisiveness of a 4-year-old. Charles had finished the outdoor work early because of the cold and came in at 2 in the afternoon to find Evelyn sitting at the table with a book she had not been reading for at least 20 minutes. He made tea. He sat down. They talked, easily and at length, about the kind of things that people discover about each other in the unhurried way of a winter afternoon. He had grown up in western Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith, and had come west at 19 with $30 and extraordinary stubbornness. She told him about the schoolhouse in Harlan and the satisfaction she had found in teaching, the way a child's face looked when a thing they had been struggling with suddenly became clear. He told her about the first winter in Montana, how beautiful and lethal it was, how a man learned his own dimensions in a place that had no interest in accommodation. She told him about Ruth, the real Ruth, not the grief but the woman, funny and impatient and brave and achingly loving, who had followed her heart across 1,000 miles and built something real before the world took it from her. She was not sure she would be able to speak about Ruth without losing composure. She managed it, barely. Charles watched her through the whole of it, and when she finished he said, "She would be proud of you," simply and without embellishment, and that was when her composure departed entirely, quietly in the way of water finding a low place, and she put her face in her hands and cried for the first time in months. He did not move immediately. He gave her a moment, in the way of a person who understands that grief sometimes needs a breath of air before anything else. Then he moved his chair around to her side of the table and put his arm around her shoulders, and she turned toward him without deciding to and pressed her face against his shoulder and cried properly for the first time since Ruth died. He held her. He did not offer platitudes. He held her steady and solid and warm while the winter sat outside the windows and me slept in the back room and the fire in the stove kept everything safe. And she cried until she was empty, and the empty feeling was not, as it had sometimes been, cold and hollow, but instead was clear, like a sky after rain. She lifted her head. She was close, very close, and his face was right there, those gray eyes careful and warm and close, and she thought she should perhaps move back, except that she did not want to and he did not seem to want her to either. "I want to say something," he said. His voice was very quiet. "All right," she said. "I am not certain of many things anymore," he said. "But I am certain that this being here is the first thing that has felt right in a very long time. And I do not mean the work or the purpose, though those matter. I mean here," he paused, "with you." She looked at him in the December light. "I am certain of that too," she said. He kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss or a questioning one. It was a gentle and deliberate kiss of a man who was entirely sure of the intention behind it. And she kissed him back with the decision of a woman who had finally stopped arguing with herself and chosen to be in the thing she was already in. Clara came home from the Marsh house at 4:30 and walked into the kitchen and found them sitting at the table with tea and the specific dignified composure of two adults who have arranged themselves carefully. Clara looked at them both with those dark, perceptive 6-year-old eyes and then looked at Evelyn and said, "Your face is different." "I beg your pardon." "Your face," Clara said, pulling off her coat. "It looks different, like when you figure out a hard sum." Charles made a sound behind his cup that was very carefully not a laugh. "Go wash your hands for supper," Evelyn said firmly. The thing between them grew slowly and with intention, which suited them both because they were alike in that way, people who built things properly rather than quickly. He began to touch her in the small ways that were available to them without alarming the children or the town. His hand at the small of her back when he stepped past her in the kitchen, her shoulder against his arm on the porch in the evenings when they sat with coffee after the girls were in bed. The evenings became something she looked forward to with an anticipation that was sweet and a little aching. They talked about everything. His time in Montana, her years in Harlan, the mechanics of the homestead's future, the books on her shelf, the question of whether God was paying attention to individual lives or had made the world in the manner of a craftsman who completes his work and puts it down. He had a quality she found increasingly rare and precious, the quality of genuine listening. He did not listen to respond. He listened to understand. She had always been the kind of woman who said what she meant and found it effortful to be around people who made her translate herself. With Charles, she never translated. She said things and he simply received them. In January, Holt came back. He came on a Tuesday morning when Charles was out at the south fence and Evelyn was alone in the house with me. He tied his horse at the gate and walked up the path and knocked with a kind of authority that suggested he was not entirely certain he should knock at all. She opened the door. "Miss Finley," he said. His expression was different from the festival, harder, less groomed. "I need to discuss something with you." "Come in," she said, because she was not going to speak to the sheriff in the cold if she could help it, and because Me was watching from behind her skirt. He came in and stood in the kitchen without being invited to sit. He had papers in his hand which he held in a careful way, the way of a man deploying a weapon. "There has been a complaint filed," he said, "with the county office regarding the suitability of this household as a residence for minor children." The room tilted slightly and then righted itself. Evelyn kept her face entirely still. "What complaint? Filed by whom?" "It has been suggested," Holt said, setting the papers on the table without meeting her eyes, "that an unmarried woman running a homestead with an unmarried male laborer is not a suitable environment for two young girls in her care. The complaint suggests there is a question of moral appropriateness." She felt cold fury move through her from feet to throat. She said very quietly, "Who filed this complaint, Sheriff Holt?" "The complaint is anonymous," he said. "There is nothing inappropriate about this household," she said. "Mr. Yates lives in the barn room. He works this property and he has done so with complete propriety. Miss Finley." Holt's voice dropped and his eyes finally came to hers, and she saw in them the thing she had suspected but hoped was wrong. The calculation of a man who was using the law the way a card player uses a low card, not to win, but to force a fold. This situation could be resolved very simply. If you were to reconsider my earlier offer, there would be no reason for this matter to proceed any further. The girls would have a proper home, you would have security, and the complaint would be withdrawn. The silence that followed was extraordinary in its quality. She looked at Holt for a long time. She thought about what kind of woman she was. She thought about what kind of woman she intended to remain. "Get out of my house," she said. His jaw went hard. "Miss Finley, I am trying to help you understand. "You are trying to coerce me," she said. Her voice was absolutely level. "You filed this complaint yourself or had someone file it for you, and you are now here offering to make it disappear if I agree to marry you. That is not a misunderstanding I am open to having corrected. Get out of my house." Holt picked up the papers and tucked them back under his arm. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I am making it exactly as hard as it needs to be," she said. "Goodbye, Sheriff." He left. She stood at the kitchen window watching him ride away, and she was shaking, not from fear but from the accumulated force of 9 months of managing everything alone, and this being the moment where the weight of it pressed most visibly against the inside of her chest. Me was still behind her, very quiet in the way small children go quiet when the air in a room changes. "Aunt Evelyn," Me said, "are you mad?" "Yes," Evelyn said, "but not at you." "Okay," Me said. And then after a pause, "Can I have an apple?" Evelyn almost laughed. She cut an apple in 4 pieces and handed them down and said, "Go find your blocks, sweetheart." And when Mia trotted off, she let herself have 30 seconds of shaking before she squared her shoulders and went to find Charles. He was at the fence as expected, in the January cold with his breath making clouds, and he straightened when he saw her coming across the snow with the expression on her face. She told him everything without embellishment, exactly as it had happened. He listened with his hands very still at his sides. When she finished, he said, "What do you need me to do?" She had expected something more complicated from him. An opinion, a plan. Perhaps even a male instinct to manage the situation himself. Instead, the question was perfectly placed, because it assumed, correctly, that she was the one who would decide the shape of the response. "I need to write to the county office directly," she said. "I need to understand what complaint has actually been filed and under what authority, and I need to respond to it in writing with a clear account of this household and its arrangement." "I will write something," he said. "Whatever you need from me. Character reference, account of employment, whatever the form requires." "There is something else," she said. He waited. "I want to speak to a lawyer," she said. "There is a man in Denver, a Mr. Abernathy, who I wrote to once about the property deed. I believe if there is any legal threat to my guardianship of the girls, I need a proper legal opinion, not just my own conviction that the complaint is improper." "I can ride to Denver," Charles said. "You do not need to ride to Denver," she said. "I can write." "It is faster to ride," he said, "and I would like to be useful if I can." She looked at him in the January cold, the mountains enormous and white behind him. She thought about what it meant that she trusted him the way she trusted him. That this man who had come to her door in September was now the person she walked across frozen fields to find when something frightened her. "All right," she said. "Thank you." He went to Denver in 3 days. He was gone 4, and she managed the homestead and the girls in general and the chickens and the evening hours without him with a competence that she was proud of, and a loneliness she had not anticipated the depth of. Clara asked twice where Mr. Yates was. Me asked every morning when he was coming back. Evelyn answered patiently and truthfully, and tried not to ask the same question too often inside her own heart. He came back on a Thursday evening with a letter from Mr. Abernathy, the Denver lawyer, a letter from the county office clarifying the nature and status of the complaint, and in his coat pocket something he produced at the kitchen table after the girls were in bed. It was a small velvet pouch. He set it on the table between them. Evelyn looked at the pouch and then at Charles. "I did not plan this in Denver," he said. "I want you to know that. I did not go to Denver intending to come back with this. But I was at the jeweler's to have a small repair done to a pocket watch, and I saw it in the case, and I stood there for a long time thinking about whether I was rushing something that needed more time, and then I thought about the fact that we have talked more honestly in 4 months than most people manage in a lifetime, and that I know what I know, and I would rather say it plainly than spend any more time being careful when careful is not what I actually feel." She had not moved. He said, "Evelyn, I love you. I love those girls. I love this house and this difficult mule and this whole stubborn, beautiful life you are building on this ridge. I am asking you to let me build it with you." Properly, not as your employee and not as your tenant, but as your husband if you will have me." She opened the pouch. It was a ring. Simple gold with a small garnet center stone, the deep red of autumn leaves. It was not extravagant, it was exactly right. She looked at it for a long time. "There is something I need to say to you," she said. "Say it," he said. "I am aware that some people might think this is a practical choice," she said. "A woman in a difficult position, and a man who can improve that position. I want you to know that is not what this is. I want you to know that if you had arrived here with nothing and offered nothing but yourself, I would be at exactly this same moment saying exactly what I am about to say." She looked up from the ring to his face. "I love you too. Yes. Absolutely yes." He came around the table and she stood, and he held her with the careful strength of a man who understood how to hold something that mattered. And she held him back with everything she had been holding onto alone for 9 months. And the kitchen was warm and the fire was burning. And outside the mountain stood in the dark, and the stars were very fierce and very clear. They were married in February. The wedding was in the Colton Ridge Church on a Saturday, and Evelyn wore the deep blue dress she had brought from Kansas that she had never found a proper occasion for, and Charles wore a suit coat borrowed from the minister, because his own coat was still the canvas one, and the minister's wife had pressed the borrowed one until it had no complaints left. Clara was the flower girl, and took the responsibility with a seriousness that made 3 women in the front pew cry. Me fell asleep on the front bench halfway through the ceremony, and had to be held by the minister's wife, which she did not wake up for. The Marsh family was there, and the Henley family and the school teacher, a young woman named Miss Pratt who had taken Evelyn's letter of reference seriously, and had told Evelyn afterward that she was the finest children's aunt in the territory. The church was small, and the wedding was not elaborate, but it was completely real, the way things are real when they have been earned. Holt's complaint had been reviewed by the county office and dismissed, because Mr. Abernathy's letter had been quite thorough, and because the county office had its own skepticism about anonymous complaints that appeared to serve the interests of the person with authority to file them. Holt himself had been notably absent from most public events since December, and was rumored to be considering a posting in another county. Evelyn did not spend any particular energy on the question of Holt. She had other things to spend energy on. Spring came with its mud and its hope, and Charles broke the lower field in 3 weeks with General and a borrowed second mule from the Henley farm. They planted in April. Winter wheat and corn, and a kitchen garden that was considerably more ambitious than the previous years, because Charles had expanded it over the winter, turning the cold months into an improvement project that transformed the homestead in ways both practical and visible. The leaking roof was not the only thing that had been fixed. The whole property had the look, by spring, of something cared for by people who intended to stay. Clara started school in September. She had already been reading for a year because Evelyn had taught her, and the schoolteacher sent home a note after the first week saying that Clara Calloway was the most prepared child in her class and also the most opinionated, and could something perhaps be done about the second quality. Evelyn read this note aloud to Charles at the supper table, and he said, straight-faced, that he could not imagine where the child got that from, and Evelyn threw the dishcloth at him. Me turned 5 in June and entered the stage of childhood where every question required an answer, and every answer generated 3 more questions. She had taken to following Charles around the property in the mornings with the dedication of a small shadow, asking questions about the animals and the plants and the weather and the stars, and whether fish were happy, and whether God was bigger than the mountains. Charles answered every single question with the same level of careful thought, which Evelyn watched with a joy that was sometimes almost too large for her chest. In July, Evelyn realized she was expecting. She told Charles on a Tuesday evening on the porch, in the specific golden light that arrived each summer evening from behind the western ridge and turned everything amber and soft. She said it plainly because that was how she said things, and she watched his face receive it. The thing that moved through his expression was complex, and she understood each part of it. There was joy, genuine and large. There was something that was not quite grief but was adjacent to it, the shadow of the children he had lost, the boys he could not bring back. And there was something else underneath those two things, something quieter and more complete, that she understood was the recognition that the door he had closed in Montana had been reopened by a force neither of them had planned for or could fully account for. He held her hands in both of his for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. He brought her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles and closed his eyes, and she understood that the silence was not absence but fullness, the way a cup is silent when it is completely full. The baby came in March of 1876, the year after their wedding. A boy, Charles's son. She woke in the February night knowing it was time, and Charles went for the midwife, Mrs. Henley, who arrived with her bag and her competent hands and her calm manner, and who told Charles he could either go sit in the kitchen and stay out of the way or make himself useful by keeping the water hot. And he chose the latter, and the kitchen stove was never better attended in its life. The boy arrived in the early morning hours, loud and definite about his arrival, with a strong voice and dark hair, and hands that Evelyn looked at first and knew immediately were Charles's hands in miniature. Mrs. Henley laid him on Evelyn's chest, and Evelyn held him and looked at him with the deep, still certainty of a woman who has recognized something crucial. Charles came through the door and stopped. He came to the bed and sat on the edge and looked at his son for a long time without speaking. The room was quiet except for the fire and the outside birds beginning their early morning business. Clara and me were still asleep. The light was just coming gray through the window. "He looks like you," Evelyn said. "He looks like himself," Charles said, and his voice was very rough. He put one large, careful hand along the baby's head, and the baby, extraordinary in the way of newborns, turned toward the warmth with absolute trust. Charles sat there for a long time, and she watched his face move through things she did not name for him, because they were his to have without observation. And she thought about the boy named Eli who had had his mother's dark eyes and could make any animal trust him inside of 5 minutes. And she thought about Alice, who had died in the spring. And she thought about Ruth and Tom out on the Nebraska road. And she thought about all the loss that had brought both of them here, to this bed in this house. In this early morning with this new person between them. "What shall we call him?" she asked. Charles looked at her. She could see what she was offering him, the choice, the trust embedded in the choice. "Thomas," he said, "for your sister's husband." He paused. "If that is right for you." She felt tears come in a clean, unashamed way. "It is exactly right," she said. Thomas Eli Yates was christened the following month in the Colton Ridge Church, with Clara and me as his honorary elder sisters, both of whom took the responsibility with the utmost seriousness. Clara had decided she was going to be a teacher like Aunt Evelyn had been, and in the meantime she was going to teach Thomas everything she knew as soon as he was old enough to cooperate with her. Me was more interested in carrying him, which she was allowed to do under close supervision, and the expression on her face when she held her small cousin for the first time was one of those moments that Evelyn filed in the permanent record of her heart. The homestead continued to grow. Charles took on 2 additional acres of planting in 1876, and by 1877, the operation was producing enough surplus to sell regularly at the Colton Ridge market. He had a reputation in the county by then, not just as a capable farmer and builder, but as a fair and reliable man, the kind of person other people came to when they needed something done properly. The Holt situation had become a distant thing. Holt himself had left the county in the summer of 1875, and the new sheriff was a younger man named Dobbins who had no prior agenda regarding the Yates household, and who Evelyn found perfectly reasonable. Clara turned 9 in the spring of 1877, and had a birthday party with 4 friends from school, and a cake that Evelyn baked with the specific ambition of a woman who had once failed catastrophically at cake, and had since spent 2 years quietly improving. The cake was excellent. Me ate 2 pieces and then fell asleep with frosting on her face. Thomas, 14 months old and in the process of learning that walking was something humans did, fell over 3 times in the kitchen and took each collapse with the philosophical good nature that was becoming his characteristic response to adversity. Charles watched Thomas's third fall from his chair by the window. The boy sat up, looked at his hands, looked at the distance he had traveled from the fallen object to the floor, and then looked at his father with an expression that seemed to say, "I am considering this." "He is going to be a thinker," Charles said. "He already is," Evelyn said. She was clearing the birthday plates. "He spent 20 minutes this morning examining the latch on the chicken coop. He was not trying to open it. He was just looking at it." "He will be an engineer," Clara said, with the authority of a 9-year-old whose opinion on every subject had the weight of settled law. "He is 1 year old," Evelyn said. 14 months, Clara corrected, and Charles and Evelyn exchanged the look they had developed over 2 years of marriage, the one that said, simultaneously and without words, "She is absolutely correct, and also where did this child come from?" Me turned 7 in June of 1877 and had developed what Evelyn privately considered an alarming level of physical courage. She climbed everything. She had climbed the fence, the barn roof, and once memorably, partially up the big pine at the east edge of the property before Charles retrieved her with the equanimity of a man who has made his peace with the universe. Me was undeterred by any of these retrievals. She was determined, physical, and entirely confident in her own judgment, which was not, Evelyn reflected, the most restful combination of qualities in a child, but was certainly a fascinating one. Thomas took his first confident steps across the kitchen floor one morning in August of 1877, moving from the table leg to Charles's knee, with the expression of a man completing a significant journey. Evelyn was at the window and turned in time to see it and made the kind of sound that was not quite a word. Charles caught the boy and lifted him, and Thomas made his opinion of this achievement clear in a series of sounds that required no translation. In the autumn of 1877, Evelyn realized she was expecting again. This time she told Charles in the kitchen, on a Wednesday morning, with the practical directness of a woman who has already been through this once and knows the route. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her with those gray eyes full of something warm and certain. "Are you well?" he asked. First thing again, same question. "Better than well," she said. "A little tired." "Very happy." He pulled her close and she stood in the kitchen with her cheek against his chest and his arms around her, and outside the Colorado autumn was doing its full brilliant performance in gold and red, and the particular blue of a sky that has decided to be magnificent on a Tuesday for no special reason except that it can. "A girl this time, perhaps," he said. "Perhaps," she said. "It was a girl." She arrived in May of 1878, on a warm morning with the windows open and the smell of the new garden coming through. She was small and pink and astonishingly loud for her size, and she had Evelyn's dark auburn hair, which was visible even in those first hours as a suggestion of color across her small head. They named her Ruth Alice, for Ruth who had been beloved and Alice who had been loved, and the name settled into the house like something that had always been there waiting. Clara was 10 by then and considered herself Ruth's primary guardian supplementary to the parents, a role she took seriously and executed with the particular thoroughness of Clara, which meant Ruth was never without supervision, never without commentary, and never lacking for someone to read to her even when Ruth was 6 months old, and the reading was more for the reader's benefit than the recipient's. Me held Ruth with the practiced confidence of a child who has already held one baby and found the whole business more manageable than expected. Thomas, 2 years old and just beginning to build a vocabulary that he deployed with great selectivity, looked at his new sister for a long time and then said, "Small," with the air of a man making a geological observation. "Yes," Charles told him. "She is small now. She will not stay that way." Thomas considered this information with his characteristic thoughtfulness and then went back to his blocks. The summer of 1878 was a good summer, not without its ordinary difficulties. A dry spell in July that worried the corn, a breach in the north fence that required 3 days of repair, and a situation with one of the chickens that Evelyn would not describe to anyone, but that required Charles's intervention and a considerable amount of equanimity on the part of all involved parties. But the house was full in the way a house is full when it has people in it who have chosen to be there, and the land was producing well, and the evenings on the porch were long and warm, and full of the sounds of children settling into sleep and frogs, and the creek and the mountains doing whatever mountains do in the dark. They had a tradition by that summer, she and Charles, of sitting on the porch in the evening after the children were in bed and having an hour that was entirely their own. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they were quiet. Sometimes she read aloud from whatever book she was working through, and he listened with his eyes half closed and his coffee cooling beside him. Sometimes he told her things from the mountains, stories of winter survival and unlikely beauty that she gathered carefully and kept. On one such evening in August of 1878, she was quiet for a long time, and he let the quiet be, and the stars were doing their frontier performance above the ridge, and the air smelled of pine and dry grass and the faint wood smoke from the stove. She said, "I want to ask you something." "Ask," he said. "When you came to my door in September of 1874, she said, "what were you expecting? When you knocked, what were you expecting to find?" He was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark sky. "Honestly, always honestly, I was expecting a widow," he said. "The notice on the board said a woman alone with 2 small children, and I had assumed from that there had been a husband at some point. I was expecting someone tired and suspicious and possibly hostile. I was expecting to be assessed and probably turned away." He paused. "I was not expecting you. What does that mean exactly?" He looked at her then, in the way he had always looked at her, fully and without reservation. "I was not expecting someone who said exactly what she meant and listened exactly the way she wanted to be listened to and held everything together with such complete refusal to be defeated." He paused again. "And I was not expecting to sit at that kitchen table for an hour and find that I did not want to leave." She felt warmth move through her that was familiar now but had never in 4 years become ordinary. "You had nowhere pressing to be," she said. "That was not why," he said. "No," she agreed. "I know." She reached across the space between their chairs and put her hand in his. He turned his hand up and held hers in that careful, strong way that she would know in the dark, in any dark, for the rest of her life. "I am glad you knocked," she said. "I am glad you opened the door," he said. The night was around them, and the house was behind them, full of sleeping children and the life they had built. General made a sound in the barn, that particular grumbling sound that meant he was comfortable and did not want to be disturbed, which was basically his permanent philosophical position. One of the chickens shifted. The creek ran in its quiet way through the lower quarter. Clara's voice came, slightly drowsy, from the open window. "Are you two still awake?" Evelyn looked at Charles. Charles looked at Evelyn. "Yes," Evelyn called back. "Go to sleep, Clara." A pause. "I could not sleep." "Try harder," Charles said, with the perfectly calibrated gentle firmness that he had developed over 4 years of co-parenting with the most determined 10-year-old in Colorado. "Good night," Clara said in the tone of a person who is being very gracious about accepting direction. The window went quiet. In a few minutes they could hear the particular settling sounds that meant Clara had, in fact, gone back to sleep. Evelyn looked at the stars. "4 years," she said quietly. "Do you know that in September it will be 4 years since you knocked?" "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about that," she said. "About how much has happened in 4 years. The homestead, Thomas, Ruth." She meant the baby, Ruth Alice, not her sister, though both were present in the name. "The way Clara has grown. The way me climbs things," she laughed softly. "The way you and General have come to your particular understanding." General and I have an understanding based on mutual respect and the shared knowledge that I am going to be there every morning regardless of his feelings about it, Charles said, and she could hear the smile. That is not so different from marriage, she observed. I am choosing to take that as a compliment, he said. She turned to look at him in the dark. The porch lamp was low and his face was shadow and warmth, the lines of it so familiar now, the gray threaded more visibly through his beard than it had been 4 years ago, the eyes the same unchanging gray of winter sky that she had found so unsettling at the door and had come to find the most certain thing she knew. I love you, she said. She said it the way she said it, without preamble, without the soft approach, just the direct, plain truth. I love you, he said back. He said it the same way. Flat and final and completely true, she turned back to the stars. They sat there until the air grew too cold for comfort, and then they went inside and banked the fire and checked on the children with the quiet efficiency of people who know their house in the dark. And they went to bed in the room that had been empty when she arrived, and was now full of the specific accumulation of a shared life. His books stacked on his side, her shawl on the chair, the small things that had added up over time to mean everything. In the morning she would make breakfast, and Charles would do the barn first thing and General would be uncooperative, and me would probably attempt to climb something inadvisable, and Thomas would spend 20 minutes examining something ordinary with extraordinary focus, and Clara would have an opinion about all of it, and the baby would require everything at once, and the homestead would need its daily attention, and she would make a list and work through the list and add things to it, and there would never be quite enough. Hours, and it would be full and demanding and completely, entirely right. This was the life. Not the life she had planned in Harlan, Kansas, with her small salary and her small room and her belief that careful choices were sufficient protection, but the real life. The one that had arrived, unplanned and unasked for, with grief at the leading edge and love right behind it, a mountain man's knock on a September door, 2 small girls asleep in the back room, and the whole extraordinary ordinary future in the dark, outside the window waiting to become the past she would one day look back on and call, without any hesitation, everything. Outside, the mountains stood as they had always stood, indifferent to the particular human drama at their feet, which had involved a woman alone, and then, because life and luck and the stubborn human desire to show up for each other refused to be argued with, not alone anymore. The creek ran. The stars burned. The house breathed in the dark the way houses do when they are genuinely lived in. And the 5 of them slept, all of them, inside the walls that Charles had patched and the roof that no longer leaked and the life that had been, against all reasonable prediction, exactly enough. More than enough. Full.